Racist police mistakenly arrest Deputy Minister of Justice, and the ending couldn't be more bitter. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip low over the city when the Deputy Minister of Justice left a family gathering. He had attended his niece's birthday celebration at a modest home on the outskirts of town. Wanting to enjoy the evening air, he decided not to call for his official car. Instead, he wore simple clothes, jeans, a light shirt, and a jacket, and walked toward a nearby cafe before heading home. To most people, he looked like an ordinary man. Only those who knew him closely understood his position and influence within the government. As he strolled along the quiet street, 2 police officers on patrol noticed him. They had been scanning the area, responding to a report of a suspicious figure in the neighborhood. One of them narrowed his eyes. "He looks like the guy we've been told about," the officer muttered. His partner nodded, already convinced without much thought. They pulled their vehicle to the side of the road and stepped out, their expressions firm and suspicious. The deputy minister turned his head when he heard the sharp command, "Sir, stop right there." He paused, surprised at the tone. The officers approached quickly, blocking his path. "We need to ask you a few questions," one said. He smiled politely. "Of course, officers. Is there a problem?" But they didn't answer directly. Instead, one of them asked for identification, while the other studied him with clear doubt. The deputy minister calmly reached into his pocket for his wallet. "Here is my ID," he said, handing over a sleek card with his full name and government seal. The officer barely glanced at it. "This doesn't prove anything. We've had cases of fake IDs before." The deputy minister's brows furrowed. He tried again, keeping his voice measured. "Please look carefully. I am the Deputy Minister of Justice. My office can confirm this." But the officers exchanged looks of disbelief. One scoffed, "Deputy Minister? Dressed like this? Walking around alone? Nice story." Before he could protest further, they grabbed his arm and twisted it behind his back. He winced at the unnecessary force. "This is not the way to handle this," he said, his voice rising. "You are making a mistake." His words only fueled their suspicion. "Resisting arrest, are we? That makes you look even guiltier." They snapped handcuffs around his wrists and pulled him toward their car. On the opposite side of the street, a few pedestrians had stopped, alarmed by the scene. A young woman raised her phone and began recording. "That man is saying he's a government minister," she whispered to her friend. Others watched in silence, shocked at the sight of a man who carried himself with calm dignity being treated like a common criminal. Inside the police car, the deputy minister sat in silence, his chest tight with frustration. He had spent years shaping laws to protect citizens, and yet here he was, handcuffed by the very people who were supposed to serve justice. He wondered whether the officer's disbelief stemmed purely from his casual appearance or from something deeper, an unwillingness to see a man of his background as someone who could hold power. At the station, things worsened. The officers led him inside, ignoring his repeated attempts to explain. "You will stay here until we sort things out," one declared, pushing him toward a holding cell. "I request to call the Justice Department immediately," the deputy minister said firmly. "This is my legal right." The officer chuckled. "Save your speeches. You're not in court. Sit down." The cell door clanged shut. The deputy minister lowered himself onto the hard bench, his mind racing. He thought of his family, who would be worried when he didn't return home on time. He thought of the irony that, despite his rank, he was powerless in that moment. Meanwhile, outside the station, the video of his arrest was already circulating on social media. It spread quickly, capturing the attention of thousands within hours. People commented in disbelief, some recognizing his face immediately. "That's the Deputy Minister of Justice," one post read. "How could the police not know who he is?" Others were enraged at the arrogance displayed by the officers, calling the scene an example of deep injustice. Back inside, the deputy minister tried once more. When a younger officer passed by, he called out calmly, "Please, I am not lying. Look into the system. My name will appear there. I serve in the Ministry of Justice." The young man hesitated, glancing at him more closely. Something about his steady eyes and formal way of speaking seemed different from the usual detainees. "I'll check," the young officer murmured before walking away. Time moved slowly. Minutes felt like hours in the dim cell. The deputy minister leaned back against the cold wall, silently reminding himself to remain patient. He had endured tougher challenges in his career, but never something as humiliating as this. At last, the young officer returned, holding a file. His expression had changed, and he looked uneasy. He turned to his seniors and whispered urgently. The deputy minister could only catch fragments: high-ranking, government, mistake. The senior officers stiffened, suddenly realizing the gravity of the situation. One rushed to the cell and opened the door, his face pale. "Sir, we apologize for the inconvenience," he stammered, fumbling with the keys to unlock the handcuffs. The deputy minister stood tall, rubbing his wrists where the cuffs had left red marks. His voice was calm but sharp. "This is not an inconvenience. This is an abuse of power." The officers shifted nervously, avoiding his gaze. The air in the station had turned heavy, thick with regret and fear. They knew the incident would not remain hidden. The video outside was already proof of what had happened. As the deputy minister walked out of the cell, escorted now with forced politeness, he carried with him a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and a deep disappointment in a system he had dedicated his life to improving. The night that began with a simple family celebration had turned into a turning point that neither he nor the officers could ever forget. And beyond those station walls, the storm of public reaction was only beginning. The news of the wrongful arrest did not stay confined to the police station walls. Within hours, the outside world had already exploded with reactions. The video recorded by bystanders was spreading across social media platforms faster than anyone could control. Some viewers were outraged, some were in shock, and others refused to believe that such a high-ranking government official could be treated with such disregard. But for the deputy minister himself, the nightmare was still unfolding inside those cold station corridors. After being released from the holding cell, he was offered a seat in the station's small office. The senior officer in charge, now visibly pale and sweating, tried to speak in a polite tone. "Sir, please, understand this was a mistake. Our men were only following routine procedure. We had no idea of your identity." His voice trembled as he spoke, realizing how thin his excuse sounded. The deputy minister leaned forward, his face calm but his eyes sharp. "Following procedure," he repeated. "You ignored my identification. You mocked me. You put me in a cell and denied me the right to make a call. That is not procedure. That is humiliation." The officers avoided his eyes, staring instead at the floor or the blank walls. They could feel the weight of the moment pressing on them. They knew this was no ordinary citizen. This was a man who had the authority to review their entire department's conduct. As the officers scrambled to explain themselves, the deputy minister stood up. He did not raise his voice, he didn't need to. The authority in his tone was enough. "Do not think this will disappear quietly. The public is already aware. You have embarrassed not only me, but the justice system itself." With that, he walked out of the station, refusing the offer of a ride home in a police vehicle. By the time he reached his residence later that evening, his phone was buzzing non-stop. Journalists wanted statements. Friends and colleagues wanted to know if the rumors were true. Even family members were calling in panic, unable to believe what they had seen online. He answered a few calls, assuring his loved ones that he was safe, but he avoided giving interviews. His silence only fueled curiosity. Meanwhile, the video kept spreading. It was replayed on news channels, debated by talk show hosts, and analyzed by political commentators. The clip showed him calmly identifying himself, only to be mocked and dragged away by the officers. People were horrified. If this can happen to someone so powerful, one commentator said, what chance does an ordinary citizen have? The next morning, crowds began to gather outside the police headquarters. Protesters held signs demanding accountability. Some shouted slogans calling for the resignation of the officers involved. Others demanded deeper reform, arguing that the issue was bigger than just one wrongful arrest. It was a symptom of a broken system. Inside his home office, the deputy minister sat with a heavy heart. He stared at the pile of reports and documents waiting for his review, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought about the years he had dedicated to building fair policies, to ensuring justice for all citizens. Yet, despite all that effort, he himself had been treated as if he were invisible. Later that day, he received a formal visit from government officials, who came with words of apology. "We are deeply sorry for what you endured," one said. The Prime Minister himself has expressed regret. This was a grave error. But the Deputy Minister could only shake his head. An error, he said quietly, is forgetting a document or misfiling a report. This was not an error. This was a mindset, a refusal to believe the truth because of what I looked like, because of assumptions made in a single moment. His words struck the officials, leaving them speechless. They knew he was right. The problem was not just about mistaken identity, it was about the deep prejudice that lay underneath. That evening, while he tried to enjoy dinner with his family, the deputy minister noticed how quiet the room had become. His wife placed a gentle hand on his arm. "You always told us that the system must be fair for everyone," she said softly. "But now you've experienced what so many ordinary people go through every day. Maybe this is the moment to push harder for change." He nodded, though his eyes were clouded with sadness. He realized she was right. His humiliation was not only personal, it was a reflection of what countless others faced silently, without cameras to capture their truth or positions of power to protect them. The next morning, he returned to his office at the ministry. The building felt the same, yet he walked in with a different weight on his shoulders. Staff members looked at him with concern, whispering among themselves. He greeted them calmly and entered his office, where a stack of newspapers awaited him. Every headline screamed about the arrest, the public outrage, and the unanswered questions about systemic prejudice. One paper showed a photo of him sitting in the holding cell, taken from the viral video. The caption read, "Even the deputy minister is not safe." He folded the paper slowly and placed it aside. He knew that the story was no longer just his own. It was the story of every person who had ever been silenced, doubted, or mistreated without reason. His role now was not just to recover from the humiliation but to channel it into something larger, something that could not be ignored. But even as he prepared to take that step, he knew the road ahead would be long and bitter. The story of the deputy minister's arrest had become more than a simple mistake, it was now the center of national attention. By the third day, the incident had moved far beyond social media. Every major television channel, radio program, and newspaper was covering it. The images of him being dragged into the police car were replayed again and again. People debated the meaning of it all, and the anger in the public only grew louder. Crowds continued to gather outside government buildings. Protesters held up signs that read "Justice for all" and "If he's not safe, who is?" Chants filled the air as ordinary people expressed their frustration. Some spoke to reporters, sharing their own experiences of being treated unfairly, saying the deputy minister's humiliation reminded them of their own silent struggles. It was no longer about one man, it had become a mirror reflecting the pain of many. The deputy minister, though shaken, understood the responsibility that now weighed on him. He went to work each day with quiet determination, but inside he carried the memory of the cold cell, the mocking voices of the officers, and the disbelief in their eyes when he had shown his ID. Those moments haunted him, but they also fueled his resolve. At the Ministry of Justice, his colleagues watched him with a mix of respect and concern. Some were surprised by how composed he remained, even as the scandal reached international headlines. Foreign newspapers published articles with titles like "Minister of Justice Wrongfully Detained in His Own Country" and "When Power Meets Prejudice." Ambassadors sent formal notes of concern, asking whether the government would take meaningful action. Behind the scenes, pressure was building. Senior politicians argued about how to handle the crisis. Some wanted to quietly settle the matter with apologies and promises of training for police officers. Others believed stronger action was necessary. But no matter what was said in closed-door meetings, the public demanded visible accountability. One evening, the deputy minister finally broke his silence. Standing before a crowd of journalists, he delivered a calm but powerful statement. He began by thanking the people for their support, acknowledging the protests and the voices that had risen on his behalf. Then his tone grew heavier. "What happened to me should never happen to anyone," he said firmly. "I had the privilege of cameras capturing the truth, and of a position that forced recognition of my name. But what about the countless citizens who suffer in silence, without proof, without anyone to believe them? Their stories remain buried. This is not just my story, it is theirs too." His words spread quickly, touching hearts across the country. People quoted him on social media, and the speech was replayed on every channel. Many said it was one of the most honest statements they had heard from a government official in years. But inside the police department, tensions rose. The officers involved in the arrest felt the walls closing in. Some tried to defend themselves, insisting they were following protocol. Others admitted privately that they had ignored his words because they thought a man like him couldn't possibly hold such a position. Their excuses sounded weak to the public, but the department hesitated to punish them severely. As days passed, the protests only grew larger. University students joined the demonstrations, carrying banners that read "Reform Now." Families came with their children, wanting to be part of what they saw as a turning point in history. The streets near the headquarters were filled with chants that echoed through the night. Inside his own home, however, the deputy minister felt the personal cost of the ordeal. His children asked why their father had been treated that way. His wife, though strong, worried about his safety. Friends called him daily, some offering sympathy, others urging him to use his power to demand real change. He listened to them all, but the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders. He could not sleep easily. Every time he closed his eyes, he remembered the moment when the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. He remembered the cold bench, the sound of the cell door slamming shut, and the smirk of the officer who told him his ID proved nothing. Those images had etched themselves into his mind. And yet, he reminded himself that his pain had meaning if it could lead to reform. He knew the public's voice was stronger now than ever before. The protests had turned his humiliation into a movement, and he understood that this was bigger than his personal dignity. When he returned to the ministry the next day, he made a decision. He called his advisors and began drafting a set of proposals: new laws, new oversight measures, stricter accountability for misconduct. He wanted to present them to Parliament as soon as possible. Still, he knew resistance was inevitable. There were people in power who did not want change, who would prefer to let the outrage fade. He braced himself for the battle ahead, aware that it would not be easy. But as he looked out of his office window at the growing crowds chanting for justice, he whispered to himself, "This fight is no longer about me. It is about them. It is about everyone who deserves respect, no matter who they are." The public outcry had begun as a reaction to his arrest. But now, it was transforming into something far greater: a demand for true justice, one that could not be silenced by apologies or hidden behind excuses. And deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The official inquiry began on a quiet morning that felt anything but ordinary. A retired judge was appointed to lead it, along with a small team of legal experts, a community representative, and a data analyst who would review patterns in stops and detentions. The hearing room was simple: a long table, a row of chairs, a recorder on the desk, and a flag standing in the corner. But the atmosphere carried a heavy weight. Everyone understood that the process was not only about one incident, it was about trust, rules, and the kind of country people wanted to live in. The deputy minister arrived without a large entourage. He wore a plain suit and carried a folder containing his statement and supporting documents. When he stepped into the room, every head turned. He greeted the panel quietly and took a seat. The retired judge nodded to him in respect, then signaled for the clerk to begin recording. The first day would be about timelines: who saw what, who said what, and when. It sounded simple, but the truth often hides in the small details. The panel first reviewed the public video. Slow, frame by frame, they watched him present his identification with calm hands, watched the officers glance and dismiss it, watched the handcuffs come out, watched the car door close. The room stayed silent as the clip ended. Then they examined internal logs from the station, the time of arrival, the note saying detained for questioning, and the lack of any entry about his request to call his office. The missing line said more than any speech could. In the afternoon, the first officer testified. He sat stiffly, flanked by a union representative and a department lawyer. He spoke about a report of a suspect in the area and said he believed he was following standard steps. But under gentle, careful questions from the retired judge, his story revealed cracks. Why had he not verified the ID through the central system, as protocol required? Why had he refused a phone call? Why was the tone of his voice, captured in the video, so dismissive? He shifted in his chair and said, "It was a tense situation. We had to act quickly." The judge paused and asked softly, "Act quickly, or listen carefully?" The question hung in the air. He looked down and did not answer. The second officer's testimony came next. He repeated the word procedure often, but the documents on the table spoke differently. The data analyst showed that a simple check, one that would have taken less than 2 minutes, could have confirmed the deputy minister's identity. The panel noted that it was not done. The second officer grew quiet, and for a moment his face looked tired and unsure. In that brief look, the room felt a truth that the words tried to avoid: it was not only about speed, it was about assumptions. Outside the building, news vans lined the curb. Reporters updated the nation with each session. The public watched with hope and worry. Many feared the inquiry would result in a polite report and then fade away. Others clung to the belief that this time would be different. Inside homes and cafes, people discussed the hearings as if they were talking about their own families, because in a way, they were. On the second day, the panel invited community witnesses. A shop owner from the street where the stop happened spoke first. He had seen the deputy minister show his ID clearly. "I thought the officers would say sorry and leave," he explained. "But they didn't. They seemed sure they were right." He looked down at his hands. "I wanted to help, but I was afraid I might make it worse." A student who filmed part of the video described the mood on the sidewalk. "People were confused," she said. "We were scared to speak up, but we knew something was wrong." The retired judge thanked her for coming forward and asked what made her press record. She put a hand to her heart and said, "Because sometimes the truth needs help to be seen." When it was the deputy minister's turn to speak, the room became still. He did not read from the papers he had prepared. He talked slowly, in simple words, about a walk after a family gathering, about a calm greeting to the officers, about the moment his ID was rejected, and the cold feel of the cuffs. He did not raise his voice or accuse anyone by name. Instead, he spoke about what it feels like when your truth is ignored, and how easy it is, in a few minutes, to take away someone's dignity. He ended with a steady message: I do not want revenge. I want learning, and I want change. I want a system where listening is the first step, not the last. Where a uniform protects both the public and the person who wears it, because respect must flow in both directions. The panel members scribbled notes. Some swallowed hard. The retired judge thanked him, then asked a final question: what would healing look like? The deputy minister paused. Healing, he said, would look like clear rules that everyone can trust and the courage to follow them even when it is not comfortable. In the days that followed, the panel dug into records. The data analyst presented charts showing patterns in stops and detentions over the past 2 years. The numbers showed certain neighborhoods faced far more checks than others. Complaints from those areas often described similar moments: ignored explanations, quick hands on cuffs, long waits for simple verification. The panel also reviewed training materials. Some sections were strong on de-escalation and dignity, but many parts were outdated or vague. There were gaps you could drive a truck through. The police leadership testified as well. They spoke about a culture of service, about the stress of the job, and about the need to support officers on the street. The retired judge listened with respect, then asked careful questions about supervision. How often were body camera clips reviewed? How quickly were complaints logged and answered? What happened to officers with repeated complaints? The answers were long and full of terms, but the meaning was clear: the system had many doors, and too many of them were half open. At the ministry, the deputy minister continued shaping his proposals. He collaborated with legal teams and community advisors to design a simple set of steps that would be hard to ignore. First, a verify first rule before any detention: officers must check ID claims through the system when it is safe to do so. Second, an independent desk to review complaints within strict time frames, with public summaries released monthly. Third, a training refresh that focused on listening, cultural awareness, and clear communication, led by respected instructors from both the service and the community. And fourth, a system of transparent consequences that matched actions, not titles, with a path for improvement but also firm limits. He kept the language clear and short on purpose. He wanted rules that a citizen could read on a bus ride and understand. Back at the inquiry, the union representatives raised concerns. They warned against policies that might make officers hesitate in dangerous moments. The retired judge agreed that safety matters and emphasized that the new rules must protect both the public and officers. The deputy minister's team edited the proposals again, adding a simple line that would be repeated many times: when safety allows, verify first. When safety does not allow, stabilize the scene and verify the moment it does. On the fourth day, the panel reviewed internal messages sent after the arrest. The messages did not contain foul words, but they revealed worry about optics rather than about the person. One note said, "We need to manage the story." Another said, "Keep statements short." The retired judge read them out loud. The room heard not hatred, but a kind of distance from the real harm. And that distance felt like a second injury. Meanwhile, the public grew more hopeful. Small groups began hosting roundtables in libraries and community centers. People from different neighborhoods sat together and shared stories, some painful, some encouraging. A quiet wish floated over these meetings, that this time, the report would not just sit on a shelf. The deputy minister met privately with the police chief. They spoke for a long time. He did not demand resignations or shout. He requested one commitment: that the chief would stand beside him when the reforms were presented and say, in public, "We will do better, and here is how." The chief looked tired and thoughtful. He agreed, but asked for time to speak with his ranks. "Change is heavy," he said. "I need them to feel safe with it." The deputy minister nodded. "Safety and dignity must grow together," he replied. "If one is weak, both fall." As the inquiry neared its end, the retired judge prepared his findings. He wrote in clear, steady sentences. He acknowledged the stress of police work and the service many officers provide with honor. He also stated, with equal clarity, that the stop and detention of the deputy minister broke rules that should have been followed, and that the dismissive tone seen on video reflected deeper habits that must be unlearned. He recommended the Verify First rule, faster complaint reviews, better training, and a transparent consequence ladder. The final hearing drew a crowd that filled the hallway. Reporters waited with microphones ready. The deputy minister sat quietly in the second row, hands folded. The retired judge read the summary. People listened without moving. When he finished, there was no applause, only a hush that felt like a held breath. The path was clear on paper. Now came the hard part, walking it. That evening, the deputy minister went home late. He stood by the window and watched the lights of the city flicker like small promises. He knew reforms can be announced in a day but are built over years. He also knew that promises can bend under pressure. He took a slow breath and reminded himself why he started, not for pride, but for the next person who would meet a patrol car on a quiet street. In the quiet of that night, hope and caution stood side by side. The inquiry had shown the truth with patient light. The proposals were ready. The nation was watching. And just out of sight, forces that resist change were also preparing their moves. The story was not over. It was entering the part where systems either open their doors or find new ways to stay the same. The day of the final report's release was filled with anticipation. Crowds gathered again in front of government buildings, holding signs, and waiting for the words that could decide whether this moment would mean true reform or just another forgotten scandal. Inside Parliament, the deputy minister sat with quiet composure, though his heart was heavy. He knew the findings were strong, the recommendations clear. Yet he also knew that between a report and real change lay a wall of politics, hesitation, and self-interest. When the retired judge stepped forward to present the report, the chamber grew silent. He read out the conclusions in measured tones. The officers had failed to follow rules, they had ignored identification, and their actions revealed systemic problems that required urgent attention. He recommended the Verify First rule, independent complaint review, new training, and transparent consequences. His words carried the weight of truth, carefully balanced, impossible to deny. The deputy minister listened intently. Around him, lawmakers nodded, some with approval, others with guarded expressions. He could almost hear the gears turning in their minds, calculating costs, weighing public pressure against political convenience. He had seen this pattern before, but this time he hoped it would be different. Outside, when the findings were announced, the public responded with cautious celebration. Chants rose, calling the report a victory for truth. But mixed with the cheers were voices of doubt: will they really act? Or will this fade like all the others? That question echoed across the country. In the days that followed, the government pledged reforms. Press conferences were held where officials promised that new measures would be implemented swiftly. But behind closed doors, the pace slowed. Drafts of new policies were passed around, revised, delayed. Committees debated the language of each rule, softening words here, adding exceptions there. What began as clear proposals slowly turned into something less sharp, less certain. The deputy minister pushed tirelessly. He met with leaders, argued in hearings, and wrote personal notes to colleagues reminding them of their duty. But he noticed the resistance growing stronger. Some officers' unions opposed the changes, saying they would harm morale. Certain politicians whispered that the outrage had already cooled, that the nation would soon move on to the next headline. At home, his family reminded him to take care of himself. His wife often found him late at night, sitting at his desk surrounded by papers, his face marked with both determination and weariness. "You cannot carry the whole weight alone," she told him gently. But he felt he must, for he knew that if he let go, the reforms could vanish. Weeks passed. The first training sessions were scheduled, but only as pilots. The complaint desk was announced, but without full independence. The Verify First rule was adopted, but with so many exceptions that it lost much of its strength. The deputy minister realized that change was coming, but it was slower, weaker, and more fragile than what the people had demanded. And then came the bitter part. The officers who had humiliated him faced a disciplinary review. Many expected they would be dismissed or at least suspended for a long period. But the result was lighter. One was reassigned to desk duty for a few months, the other was given mandatory training. Both kept their jobs. When this decision became public, the reaction was sharp. People were furious. Protesters returned to the streets, shouting that justice had not been done. If this is all the punishment for what they did to the deputy minister, they cried, what punishment will there be for what they do to us? The deputy minister himself felt a deep sting. He had not wanted revenge, but he had hoped for accountability that could restore trust. Instead, the outcome felt like a message that the system protects its own more than it protects the people. In Parliament, he spoke again, this time with sadness in his voice. We stand here today with a chance to build trust, he said. But if accountability is light, if reforms are watered down, then this moment becomes bitter. Not for me alone, but for the citizens who believed change was possible. His words were broadcast live, and people across the nation heard the disappointment in his tone. After the speech, he walked out of the chamber slowly. Reporters crowded around, asking if he would resign. He did not answer. He only said, my work will continue, but trust must be earned, not spoken. At home that evening, he sat quietly with his family. The house was filled with silence. His children looked at him with worry, sensing the weight he carried. His wife held his hand. You have done what you could, she whispered. Sometimes change takes longer than we wish. But he knew in his heart that the moment had slipped away. The scandal had shaken the nation, but the system had bent rather than broken. Some reforms would remain, but they were weaker than they could have been. The officers kept their jobs, the protests began to fade, and soon the headlines turned to other stories. For the deputy minister, the bitterness was not just about his own humiliation. It was about watching an opportunity for deep reform melt into half measures. He returned to his office every day, still working, still pushing, but with the heavy knowledge that the system he served had failed to rise fully to the moment. And so, the ending was bitter indeed. Not because the truth had been hidden, but because the truth had been seen clearly, and yet still, the system resisted. The deputy minister carried on, scarred but steady, knowing that history would remember the incident not as a story of full victory, but as a reminder of how fragile justice can be, even in the hands of those sworn to protect it.